All right, y'all. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. My name is Rhoda Kelly. I'm a bookseller here at Left Bank Books, and I, along with all of our Left Bank Books team, welcome you to Left Bank. Please help me in welcoming our award-winning author and librarian, Dorothy Lazard, and her award-winning memoir, What You Don't Know Will Make a Whole New World. So, some notes before we begin. Today's event is possible because of support from folks like you. When you support Left Bank Books, your money goes directly into the local economy, funding your streets, parks, and more. And it also helps writers get the support that they deserve. And it also allows us to produce events like this. So thank you all for shopping local, and thank you for being here tonight. If you enjoyed tonight, please know that Left Bank Books plans new events for readers of all ages all year round. So in just 2 days, we're going to be joined by Catherine Applegate to celebrate her new picture book, Otter, an Otter story, telling the incredible story of Otter, an adventurous baby sea otter. And then next month, on May 20th, we'll be joined by Stephen Bradley to discuss his new book, If We Don't Get It, A People's History of Ferguson. So Bradley's book discusses how Mike Brown's murder sparked a grassroots movement of democracy led by Black youth, which transformed the way we talk about race, justice, and policing in the U.S. And if either of those sound compelling, please join us back here at Left Bank Books for another event. But for tonight's event, our guest is Dorothy Lazard. She was born here in St. Louis and grew up in San Francisco and Oakland. A librarian for nearly 40 years, she joined the staff of the Oakland Public Library in 2000. From 2009 until her retirement in 2021, she was the head librarian of OPL's Oakland History Center, where she encouraged people of all ages and backgrounds to explore local history. Lazard is the 2023 recipient of the Oscar Lewis Award in Western History from the Book Club of California. And for her book tonight, What You Don't Know Will Make a Whole New World. This is her first book where she vividly tells the story of her journey to becoming, quote, queen of her nerdy domain. In these pages, she connects her early intellectual pursuits to the career that made her a community pillar. She traces the trajectory to adulthood, where she explores her personal experiences connected to the Summer of Love, the murder of Emmett Till, the flourishing of the Black arts movement, and the redevelopment of Oakland. As she writes with honesty about the tragedies she faced in her youth, her memoir remains triumphant and animated by curiosity, careful reflection, and deep enthusiasm for life. Thank you so much for listening to my voice for so long. Without further ado, Dorothy Lazard.
Thank you, Rhoda. I am famous for not taking pictures of any event that I participate in, so I'm going to take a picture of all of you now. Say books. Books. Say family. Family. Yeah. This is, wow. This is quite an accomplishment for me to be at a bookstore that I've always wanted to present a talk to or reading to. And to have my St. Louis family here. So much of my public life is spent by myself. And so this is major to have my family here in a place where I was born, or a place where I first had any kind of sensation of life and family and things like that. It's wonderful to have us all in the same room. So I haven't seen some of these people since I was 7 years old. Exactly. Jack would say, wow. So I wrote this book because I was compelled to, because I had reached an age where I was wondering, well, who am I? How did I get to be who I am right now? And that was, 2017, 2018. And in 2018, I was coming up on a 50th anniversary. We left here, my mother, my brother, and I left St. Louis in March of 1968. And an uncle we didn't know and a grandmother we didn't know came to rescue us from St. Louis. And so that altered the trajectory of my life. Would I have been the same person had I stayed here? Would my mother be the same person had she stayed here? So these were the kinds of questions that I was asking myself back in 2018 as that 50th anniversary of the California was coming up. Did I want to give a party to celebrate? Not really. So I started writing and starting to finding and piecing together things I had written about my life in California, my life among my Baskin family in California, my memories of my Lazard family here in St. Louis. And this is what I ended up coming up with, this book. And so tonight I want to read you a bit of how we came to leave St. Louis. And then I want to also read a little bit from the second chapter, which is about my last year here in St. Louis. I am famously known as a Northern Californian, and there is a difference between the Northern Californian and the Southern Californian. And that's what the bulk of the book is about. But since I'm here in St. Louis, among my St. Louis relatives, I want to start where I started. So I'm going to start The Road West, 1968. And before I go on, thank you all for coming. My family arrived in California the winter after the Summer of Love. Ours was not the journey of eager anticipation of the 19th century gold miners who rushed to the Sierra, or of the anxious desperation of the Dust Bowl refugees who came before us. We were reluctant migrants, but all children are. And the three of us in the backseat of that white Pontiac were indeed children, my mother, my big brother Albert, and me. My grandmother Ella Baskin had come to claim us. We were part of her family who had been living precariously, but sometimes contentedly in St. Louis, away from her and the rest of my mother's clan. This was our first cross-country trip. Our first cross-country trip marked the end of our independence as a nuclear family. The journey along Route 66 was the end and the beginning of everything we had known and would know. As we traveled long and desolate stretch of the highway, with my mother's younger brother Shelby driving, I tried to imagine what California would be like. The nuns at St. Vincent's had told me about the Golden Gate Bridge, which with my 8.5-year-old imagination, I thought would be truly golden. We were headed to San Francisco, to my grandmother's house where we would live. For how long, the nuns at St. Vincent's didn't say. Uncle Shelby, or Shirley, as my grandmother called him, was jovial and gregarious. He told us all about the cousins we didn't know we had, and the aunt and another uncle we would soon meet. He was an enthusiastic hugger, which I wasn't used to, but I liked just the same. He was solicitous to my mother, and like her, smoked cigarettes like they were going out of style. So I figured they must be related. In that car, I began to see my mother with fresh eyes. Medea was not just my mother, our mother, my father's wife. He was part of something larger, more complex than our nuclear family. Her name was Laverne, but this uncle called her Sis, which gave me the first hints of her having a role other than mother and wife. She had a family that she had been born into, a mother from whose body she sprang, a father who had already lived and died by the time our journey began. Still, I never felt in those first few days with our grandmother that Medea and her mother were close. They didn't talk much during our journey. I couldn't imagine them taking long walks together, or playing marbles, or Chinese checkers, or scrubbing each other's backs during bath time, like Medea and I did. No harsh words were exchanged between them, but I sensed that they were strangers, not on the same team. There was an unspoken tension. I couldn't remember my mother ever having talked to us about her mother. When our grandmother appeared at St. Vincent's Day Home to retrieve us, she could have been the president of Jamaica for all I knew. I had never heard a story about her or seen a picture of her. It wasn't until my brother pushed me toward the Pontiac and I saw our mother in the back seat that I began to think my grandmother could be telling the nuns the truth. And besides, they wouldn't just release us to anybody, would they? After a few days of visiting with our father, who had moved in with our oldest half-sister Mary, we left St. Louis and traveled west along Route 66 and hummed the classic Nat King Cole tune to bide the time. We survived both the curses of racists in Amarillo, who chased us off the sidewalks, and the hellish heat of the Southwest desert. That journey west was the longest time I had ever spent in the car. We didn't break our cross-country trek with a sleepover anywhere, just kept driving and riding after pee breaks and water breaks and food where we could get it. We made our first stop in Needles, California, just over the state line. Needles, I thought. What a funny name for a place. Were there needles on the ground? Is this where needles were made? Did a lot of seamstresses live there? I didn't know what to expect from the Golden State. It was beautiful in completely alien ways. It was early March and there was no snow on the ground. It wasn't even cold. The landscape was as flat as a pancake and vast, dotted with desert scrub. Then suddenly out of nowhere, we'd see mountains in the distance, so big and majestic, they looked like something out of a cowboy movie. Decidedly not urban, which was the only environment I knew. The red brick buildings of St. Louis were nowhere to be found. It was during this trip that I first considered the sky as a separate and beautiful thing, distinct from the earth, not just the incidental wallpaper to some cityscape. Out west, you could see so much of everything all at once. I sensed California could be something quite literally marvelous. It was wide open spaces, orchards, ranches, and rolling hills covered in wildflowers like I'd never seen. The 2 or 3 days we spent in the car felt like weeks, but finally, in that second week of March 1968, we arrived in San Francisco at the white 2-story duplex at 1139 Gold Street, that my grandmother called home. My Uncle Melvin, who lived downstairs with his wife Beverly and son Melvin Jr., greeted us warmly. He was also gregarious, a big guy, taller than Uncle Shirley, with a booming voice and a smile that shone from his mahogany face. The whole Baskin clan, it seemed, was upstairs to meet us. There were cousins by the dozens. I didn't try to remember all their names as each filed in front of us. There were little cousins my age and younger, and teenage cousins Albert's age and slightly older. Say hi, they were told, if they trickled in that first night. These are your cousins from St. Louis. I looked around the room, shy with all their eyes on me, and still suspicious of this mother-daughter connection. For one thing, I noticed my mother didn't look like her mother or her siblings. She was honey-colored while the rest of her family was a heavy chocolate brown. They were beautiful in their sameness, but different from the woman who was supposed to be my link to them. Medea was slender, angular, and what I considered at the time tall. My grandmother, Mamela, as everyone called her, was short and wide-hipped, with very high cheekbones, false teeth, and a large mole on her nose that kept her glasses from sliding down her face. I stuck close to my mother, looking to her for some sign of how to interact with these new people, and also because I had missed her so much after being apart for more than a year. My cousin stared at us, and I nervously stared back. I didn't know how to be around cousins. The only cousins I had known were my mother's cousins in St. Louis, all grown men, with whom I had only a passing acquaintance. Would these cousins, California cousins, be protectors, tormentors, friends? And all the hubbub and chatter and milling around, my mother collapsed, overcome by a seizure. What's wrong with her? Some of them asked. The little one shrieked with fear. Some left the room at the sight of Medea writhing on the floor. Everyone froze. Even Albert and I froze momentarily. Having not seen our mother overtaken by a seizure in over a year, and having it happen in such unfamiliar surroundings, we were incapacitated, self-conscious, exposed. When we did move toward her to perform the duties we had been so accustomed to performing, we were pushed aside as if we couldn't take care of her. Had we surrendered that responsibility by coming here? Who were we if not her caretakers? My grandmother got a towel and held it to my mother's foaming mouth, while someone else moved chairs and cousins away from her bucking legs. I realized then how new we were to this place. That lack of familiarity did not sit well with me. Back home in St. Louis, we knew where everything was. We knew which men in the neighborhood could lift our mother's dead weight and take her up the stairs to our flat if she was struck by a seizure in the street. We knew where the spoons were that in those less enlightened times we can insert into her mouth to keep her from swallowing her tongue. There was no regard for her poor teeth. Although the afternoon was heading into evening, I was told to go outside, nervous about being shuttled away from my mother, scared to leave her side, fearing another separation, another seizure. I left the house reluctantly. But how could I resist a chance to go outside on a warm winter night? I couldn't remember the last time I was out on the street at night, and never on a March night without a coat. The shackles of St. Louis and St. Vincent's started to fall away that first night in California. So I want to read a little bit more about our family that I wrote in chapter 2. I was asked by a fairly respected English professor in Oakland when this book came out in 2023, why did I start the book where I started it? And in my memory, which was the real dictator of this book, I didn't do family research or question people or interview anybody. As a writer, Tobias Wolff said about his own memoir, I wanted to write the book my memory had to tell. And that was my strongest memory. Those questions that propelled me to write the book. Who are you? How did you become who you became? Those questions were fueled by that memory of leaving that orphanage and getting in that car and with strangers. They were family, but they were strangers. And just seeing how complicated, learning right then how complicated family is. And this next bit I'm going to read is some of those complications. But I have to drink some water. And then after I read this section, if you have questions, if you want to talk about anything, I'm here to talk about it. But if you have questions about how I put the book together or anything else, we can have a Q&A. Oh, have I taken pictures? Yeah. Okay, good. I got a fancy award for being a public historian, and I didn't take one picture. It was crazy. This next chapter, this piece from this chapter is a chapter called Back Home. By the time my parents got together in the early 50s, they had both been married and had 10 children between them. But to be accurate, by the time I showed up, few of their offspring were still children. My father, whom everyone called Mr. Bear, had been widowed twice. A retiree living on a pension, he was old enough to be my mother's father. Medea was divorced with 3 kids, the youngest one a toddler, when she married Mr. Bear. With him, she had 3 more. I was the last in the line. Like most of the Lazard children, I was born at Homer G. Phillips Hospital. And it's good to be in a room with somebody when I say Homer G. Phillips Hospital and there's nods and recognition. And then also I want to say, this is the first time I'm reading this chapter because I figure Californians just won't fully get it unless they're from St. Louis. We lived on Franklin Avenue in a cold water flat over a grocery store. 4 rooms plus a toilet shed out on the front porch. We attended the parish school, St. Nicholas, as our older Lazard siblings had. A devout Catholic, my father dragged us to church every Sunday, ignoring our protests of hunger. In those pre-Vatican II days, there was no eating before you took communion, and our inability to sit still through Mass. Fortunately, St. Louis had a cry room where squirmy kids could go to ignore the sermons properly. After Mass, we'd go home and either Medea or our father would cook us a hearty breakfast. I'd sit on my father's lap while he read me the comics, and my mother listened to music on the radio. And Albert, 5.5 years older than me, would head outside to wherever boys went to entertain themselves. After breakfast, I could sometimes talk my mother into a game or 2 of marbles while my father dozed in a chair. I found my mother endlessly fascinating. Sometimes I'd watch her, riveted, as she performed the most mundane tasks, feeding our clothes through the wringer washer, ironing our sheets, and weaving gum wrappers into placemats. I marveled at how busy and creative she was in taking care of us. I was 6 or 7 years old when Medea began an extended stay in the hospital. She had been in and out of hospitals all my life, so her stays were never immediately concerning to me. We regularly went to Homer G. Phillips for one thing or another. Albert had been treated there for tuberculosis. We got our immunizations, our checkups, everything medical there. Sometime in 1966, when our father told us she was in the hospital, I assumed it was at Homer G. Days went by. Weeks went by. Our father tried to get us to school on time and to church on Sundays. He cooked our meals, but someone and something essential to the family equation was missing. The 3 of us never got into a cab to visit Medea in the hospital. Mr. Bear told us repeatedly that she'd be back home soon. My mother's older children, all living in Chicago near their father by this time, were being told the same thing. If I had to point to one particular thing that changed our fate and my parents' sovereignty over us, it would have to be my personal grooming. With my mother hospitalized, my hair care fell to my father, who had less than wise counsel from Albert. My father was a very old man with very little hair, so his comb was too insubstantial, to put it mildly, to handle my kinks. One day, while trying to get me together to head to St. Nicholas, my father got his tiny drugstore comb ensnared in my hair. He tugged. I screamed. Albert intervened, sure he knew how to get it out. But all the tugging, pulling, screaming, backcombing, and my own vain attempts came to nothing. My old man eventually asked for the scissors to free his comb and me from this agony, and off came nearly half my head hair. One of my torturers redesigned my hairdo in an attempt to make me look less crazy, but the attempt failed. It wasn't long after that Albert and I stood in stunned silence in family court while adults we didn't know decided we should be placed in care, as folks called it. We were given a choice. I could be sent to live in an all-girls orphanage, St. Francis, where a few of my older half-siblings had been placed many years earlier, or to the co-ed St. Vincent's Day Home. Albert made the decision that we should stick together. Exactly why we were being sent away or how long we'd have to stay was never made clear to me. No one explained anything to kids in those days, but I figured it had something to do with things that had gone missing. Our mother, my braid, and our father's ability to cope with 2 young kids. Still, that didn't seem justification enough to pull us from the only home we had ever known. The care was to be provided by the nuns at St. Vincent's Day Home in Florissant. St. Vincent's was a massive 3-story brick edifice that was the length of a city block, set far back from North Florissant Road and protected by an iron gate. The residents were segregated by sex and then divided into 3 age groups each. I was placed in the little girls' room for girls up to 10 years old, and Albert was placed in the middle boys' room for 11 to 14-year-olds. There were no Negro nuns and no Negro lay people. In Albert's age group, there were 2 other Negro boys, the Skinner brothers, to keep him company, but I was not so lucky. So far in the home's 50-year history, I was the first Negro girl to live in St. Vincent's. The nun assigned to our room, whose religious name I forgot long ago, introduced me to the other girls. Girls, this is Dorothy Ann. Say hello. They looked at me as if I was a circus freak. A little bit of terror and a little bit of morbid curiosity. A few gave meek hellos and then went about their business. The little girls' rooms were bright and sunny, facing the front of the building. There was a dining area with low tables and chairs, and a kitchenette that provided just enough space for washing dishes. Beyond that was a play area with doll houses and baby carriages and plastic tea sets. A half wall separated this area from the TV area, where viewing was strictly monitored and timed. We could watch Ed Sullivan on Sundays and the Monkees on Monday. Beyond the living room was a large dormitory room. Every 4 or 5 beds were separated by big wooden closets with sliding doors, where we kept our few clothes. In the far corner of that room, walled off on 2 sides, was the nun's bedroom. The walls of our nun's room did not reach up to the ceiling, so she could hear what was going on in the children's sleeping area. It was still early when the nun announced that it was time to get ready for bed. I'd always been a bit of an insomniac, staying up as late as I could to chatter with my parents, play with my brother, or watch TV, though in those days there wasn't much TV to watch at night. The nun led me into the bathroom, where a row of shower stalls lined the far wall. She explained that we girls were expected to shower before bed each night. She handed me a towel and gestured toward the free stall. I looked inside. I had never taken a shower. In my family, we bathed in big galvanized tubs positioned in front of the open stove. My mother would fill the tubs with hot water from the kettle or a big pot, and Albert and I would swish around, tapping until the water got cold. I wondered what Albert was doing now on the other side of the strange building. Was he being made to go to bed so early? Did he know how a shower worked? Were the boys staring at him as if he had landed from another planet? I looked at the shower handles, then back at the nuns. I didn't need to explain. She reached in and turned on the water, then took my hand and drew it under the flow, checking with me to see if I found the temperature okay. There were no kettles to fill here, no ovens to sit in front of to keep warm. I marveled as water rushed out from the shower head. This was the day I got an inkling of how little white people knew about Negroes. When I got out of the shower, my fresh press and curl, which our neighborhood beautician had so lovingly given me before I headed off to parts unknown, had reverted back to my natural kinks. What do I do with it? The nun whispered, sounding bewildered as she patted my spongy red hair. You press it, I said. Press it? How do I do that? I looked at her quizzically. With a straightening comb, I said. I didn't know how to better explain it. How could she not know that? She's an adult after all. Where do you go to get it back the way it was? Franklin, I said, figuring if the nun would send me to my old neighborhood to get my hair done, I wouldn't return. I assured the nun that I knew how to get there. I had paid attention to the route we took from our house to St. Vincent's. I could surely retrace it, but she told me that she'd figure it out. She would figure out what to do. I was incredulous. I didn't have the same kind of hair as other girls. I didn't know what kind of hair the nun had, or if she had any hair at all, as her head was fully covered with a wimple. She combed gingerly through my hair, going as slow as molasses. It was clear to me she was trying not to hurt me, but I felt suddenly, and for the first time, ashamed of my hair, which had never made me feel any particular way before. It was just my hair, like my mother's hair, and my brother's, and my neighbor's. But with all those watery blue eyes on me, with all those confused, disdainful gazes, I sensed I was an alien in foreign territory. They made me feel like a specimen, studying and fretting over me. Albert, I was certain, was having no such problem. Boys had it easy that way. At one point, the nun leaned down and whispered, "My real name is Dorothy, too." She sent a big grin my way, which warmed me, but don't tell the other girls. I nodded. I like having someone trust me with their secrets. It made me feel grown up, responsible, and worthy. All the best movies were about loyalty, so I made a pact to keep this secret, no matter how small. I'll stop there. Thank you for coming out. I'm feeling all the feels right now. I told the staff here at the bookstore that I've had a poster of this bookstore done by Mary Englebright, another St. Louis, who must have drawn that poster, what, in the 80s? I've had it in my house for like 30 years,
something like that, yeah.
35 years or more. And so it was always kind of a thrill to do something in this town, in this bookstore. So thank you very much.
So,
Yeah.
so when you went to the Dorothy, that name was still living.
Yeah. Yes. Could I just, I'm gonna answer that. I'm gonna
Okay.
answer all the questions. But could my relatives stand up, please? Or raise your hand if you don't want to stand. Yay, relative. All right, Shirley, stand up. This fills me with so much joy and pride because I go through a lot of my life by myself. You know, me and my husband, me and a niece or something like that, but not an audience of people. So feeling all the feels right now. Yeah, Mr. Bear was still alive. But he was very old, as we just talked about. He was very old, according to Ancestry.com, but not my birth certificate. Yes.
So when your grandmother came and got you and your uncle came and got you, your mom had just gotten out the hospital. So she's in the car with you all.
They had actually gotten her out of the hospital. She was in the hospital in Kankakee, Illinois.
Okay.
Yeah. So we're as a family, I think, still trying to piece together stories. And I think all families are, but you know, if we don't tell the stories, you know, one of the questions I get all the time is, did you talk to your family about writing the story? And I didn't, because this is only, and I always tell people, this is only my story about this family. This isn't the definitive story about the Baskin clan or the Lazard clan. It's not even my whole knowledge of the story. It's like what I was ingesting and understanding as a child.
Where's Albert?
Albert, where is Albert currently?
Does he have children?
He has 3 children.
Boys?
He has 2 boys.
So it's still male Lazard out there.
No, unfortunately, because Albert changed his name, and then those, I know. Yeah. So, you know, it's up to, well, I don't know who it's up to now to carry all that.
But in his blood, he's a Lazard.
In his blood, he's a Lazard, and he lost one of his sons, but we can talk about that off mic. Yes, Dad.
How did you feel when you saw your mom? After they told you she was in the hospital, took you away, and then all of a sudden, here's your mom.
I was super excited.
Okay.
I mean, I didn't know what was awaiting us in California. But you know, when you're 7 or 8 years old, you see your mom, you don't care what's happening there. At least I didn't.
And you said you kept staring at her, so maybe that was
Yeah.
just that
Yeah, just, let's get back to where we were. But that's the thing that I didn't know. This is like a party neighborhood. What's happening right
It's the
now?
vehicles that go by.
I don't know, turn the radios down. I'm an old lady now, turn the radios down. So, I yeah, I was very excited about my mom, but here's the thing, we didn't just lose contact with a hometown, we lost contact with our mom as an independent person, sickly, but independent. She took care of us, she did our hair, she cooked for us, she hired for us, made decisions, sent us back to the store when she thought we had given her the wrong change, that kind of mom stuff. And amongst her siblings and her mother, which I talked about in the book, she didn't have those responsibilities. They just saw her as their sickly older sister. And while there was some respect given to her as their elder sister, she was also treated much more like an invalid than she deserved, which kind of recalibrated, for me, I won't speak to Albert, kind of recalibrated how I started to see her. And, as I went into preteen, it's like, well, why isn't my mom like everybody else? So, yeah. I know. You look so intent back there. Does anybody have any questions? Has anybody in the audience tried to write their own life story? You have any questions about that? What? Shirley's doing some kind of. He'll talk about it. Shirley is my cousin. Her father is Uncle Shirley, who I just read to you about. He was our favorite uncle. He was my favorite uncle. Because he was a lot of fun. And he always kept us laughing. And anybody in the family who didn't have a dad, he was their dad. And so for some time, he was my dad, so I miss him every day. He drove me to college. He tried to teach me how to drive a car, but it's like, no, I want to live a little longer. So yeah, he's like, imagine Fred Sanford. That was him. Always had schemes, always had some plans. He was a lot of fun.
So he was from St. Louis?
Oh,
he
was my mother's. Okay, here's our migration story for my mother's side of the family. Arkansas to Chicago, Chicago to San Francisco, and that's a typical Western migration. If you're going to go to California, most people end up in the San Francisco Bay Area or LA. And we ended up, my Uncle Melvin, who I mentioned, came to California first, and then he told his brother, come out there, their jobs. And then everybody, all my mother's siblings came out. But my mother had already established herself here in her second marriage. And it wasn't until what I read you at the orphanage that she left St. Louis. And so she was always a little bit separate from her birth family and her siblings, because they were in Chicago. And she was also older than them by about, I guess the next one down was like 5 years younger than her. And she married early and had kids early. So she was kind of off on her own before most of her siblings were. Yeah. Somebody had their hand up behind Kim.
I did. I think you kind of answered it. I was going to ask, how did your mom get to St. Louis? And I thought it was part of a migration story.
Okay, here's the chisme on our family. That's gossip in Spanish. So our grandmother had kind of picked her favorite daughter and kind of put him in front of our dad. And, and Katie wasn't having it. Could you imagine? No. And so, and then somehow he ended up with our mom. And then Mr. Bear lived here. And so she just went where he was. And I think my mom was always trying to have her own independent space. The basking plans are very clannish, you know, if one person moves somewhere, they all move, you know, like they settled in San Francisco and then everybody moved to Oakland, and then everybody moved to San Jose, and then everybody moved to Sacramento. And they never just, oh, I'm doing this with me and my nuclear family. They don't really do that, which makes me an outlier because I still live. Actually, I'm the only basking in Oakland. Yeah. I've been told. So, any more questions? Does anybody want to know? Oh, yeah.
Yes. So I thought it was interesting you mentioned that this was like guided by your memory.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you're writing the memoir, was it just like, did you write like in a sort of structured way? Did you be like, I'm going to write in the morning these days, or am I just going to let it happen when it happens, sort of?
It just, you know, you just got to sit down and do the work. I just think of it like construction work, or, you know, I work in a cannery. It's just like, this is your job, do it. Now, some of this took another form, you know, like when I was 40, I went and did an MFA at Goucher College in creative nonfiction. And I had always wanted to be a writer, either a journalist or novelist, but not seriously a novelist because I barely read novels. But, and so I wrote a few of these things, what ended up in this book, a few of these scenes, as just like homework assignments during that MFA program. But then, what was it now, 2 weeks ago, I found 2 pieces of, you know, handwritten writing in a folder that was unlabeled. There were scenes that ended up in this book that I wrote decades ago. And some of them, one of them was almost verbatim, you know, I mean, and I just found those 2 pieces of paper
Cool.
like 10 days ago. So these are memories that kind of obviously kept coming back to me. And I feel like, well, what else I want to say? You know, I wasn't just plagued by those questions of how did I become who I became? Why do I think the way I do? Why do I vote the way I do? Why do I live where I live? But I was also trying to salvage my memories because I was starting to forget things. You know, I was starting to forget the names of things, and even in the process of writing this, certainly whenever you write a memoir, memories are going to come up as you recall memories. It's like, oh yeah, this, you know, but then there were some things that I just couldn't lay hands on. And since I made that commitment to myself to only write what I could remember as an exercise, now I look at it, and there are huge things that I can recall now that I couldn't recall while I was writing this. For example, when I was in high school, I wanted to be a journalist so bad. You know, we had Mary Tyler Moore Show, Lou Grant. I was reading the papers all the time. Black Panthers had papers and all that stuff. And my sister and I were just news junkies. And I was the editor of my high school newspaper. And yet I couldn't remember, I could remember my high school journalism teacher's name, but I couldn't remember anything we did together. It was so bizarre. And it's like, well, you know, you have to build a scene. You can't just say, oh yeah, I know this person. Look, how did she matter? What did you do together? What did she teach you? I couldn't access it. So there was a limit to making a decision, you know, because I felt a little hamstrung. Well, you've made this decision not to. It's ridiculous. But it was my first book, so there should be some ridiculousness in it. And then I won't tell you what it is, but I will tell this audience, and only this audience, one of my pet peeves is in it. And I'll let you find it. I'll call it an Easter egg, so it's intentional. But it's one of my pet peeves is getting something. I was a math librarian, a history and math librarian. And I got something geographically wrong, and it's bugging me. It never bugs me, but once I get down, it really bugs me because it's wrong. So I apologize. No, Don, you gotta find it. It's an Easter egg. You'll shriek when you find it.
I read the book, I don't.
Well, good. That's bad as I imagine. Yes, sir.
One more question.
Yeah.
The work that I do is to try to get books in the hands of children and middle schoolers,
Yeah.
in an effort to improve readers. And so we build these literacy spaces and we put 3,000 books.
Right.
And I would love to put your book in our middle school labs. We call them literacy. And so my question is
Is it
what
safe?
message in your book could a middle schooler get? What kind of message would you say that your book sort of like gives to some
What is,
young
tell me
people?
what middle school is, because they didn't have
Sixth to eighth grade.
6th to 8th grade.
Yeah. And even high school, because we.
Yeah, more, I think it would resonate more with high school kids than middle
You'll be
school kids.
amazed.
Well, I hope I
Middle
wouldn't be
schoolers are
amazed.
very
Middle schools are very
sophisticated.
sophisticated, good, but I don't want, I can't say I don't want my book banned, but I don't want to cause you guys any trouble. Can I read you a little bit of something that makes it fit perfectly with what you're saying? No, we didn't plan this in advance. But this is perfect what you're saying. I want to share with you something. I discovered the Western Addition Library. The Western Addition is San Francisco's historically Black neighborhood. And it was like so many Black neighborhoods was being gutted in the 60s. They had already interned the Japanese. The Japanese were locked up for, the duration of the war. And, Black wartime workers moved in, and that's been for the last 70 or 80 years a solidly Black neighborhood up until very recently. And so it was there that I discovered the library. Now, my sister Sarah came out, who my father helped raise, from Chicago after her graduation in '68 and lived with us. And she introduced me. She didn't introduce me to that library, but she made sure I had a library card. And that really changed my life. She was an avid reader. She could recite poetry. She read mysteries and all Gothic novels and all kinds of things. She ended up being a Foreign Service officer for the Agency for International Development. And I was always very proud of her. I just want to read you a little bit about her and me and what that literacy program you're working on can do for somebody. At the library, other readers egged on my new obsession. I watched what books adults pulled from the shelves. Sometimes they tell me the plot of the books they had read, and based on what they said, I would determine whether or not the books were worth my time. The librarian must have known that the books I pored over were way beyond my comprehension, but she never steered me back to the children's section. On the contrary, she suggested that I get a library card so I could take books home. I confused her by declining her offer, observing the stalemate at my house. My grandmother had said she wouldn't sign for a library card because I might lose something, then she'd have to pay for it, and no. She's very much into the world of no. This new appetite of mine reached fever pitch when my older sister, Sarah, came to Chicago, to California from Chicago to attend nursing school. 10 years my senior, Sarah was my mother's third child from her first marriage, the child my father reared after our mother's marriage dissolved. Like the Russian gold rush pioneers we had learned about in fourth grade, Sarah had heard California was a land of opportunity, a great place to get a good education and make a new life. Convinced by her grandmother that school was cheap in California, Sarah arrived in San Francisco full of hope, radical ideas, and Smokey Robinson had a miracle hour. Her hair was an explosion of Black power, a big Afro style that made me feel a little less self-conscious about my own lost hair. She owned a copy of Mao's Little Red Book and loudly condemned the Vietnam War. She was a radical in our midst, like the ones we saw on TV. Sarah blew a breath of youthful, unpredictable vigor into our quiet Victorian. Unlike my mother, my grandmother needed no medication to soothe what ailed her. She needed order. Order didn't come. When Sarah found out I liked to read but had no library card, she made sure I got one. To my relief, the librarian didn't ask any questions when Sarah nonchalantly signed the library application. The librarian simply typed out our cards and handed them over to us with a smile. I felt like a real citizen then with my first city administered membership card. Sarah had very particular taste in books. Mysteries, romances, histories, poetry, gothic tales by Edgar Allan Poe were her favorites. I'm going to skip ahead. After reading Louise Fitzhugh's children's novel, Harriet the Spy, which I was lucky enough to give to a kid last week, a neighbor kid, I took to roaming my neighborhood, pretending to be a detective like the main character. In a small steno pad, I jotted descriptions of how people spoke, ate, and held their cigarettes, how fog rolled in from the west, how the elderly lugged themselves and their parcels around. It was fun to watch life in all of its varied details go on around me. I felt my senses developing, like muscles being toned. One day, while I was playing with Peppy in the backyard, enjoying a swatch of rare afternoon sun, my grandmother called me in. "Hey, come in here." I saw the top of her head as she leaned over the banister. "You hear me? I know you're down there." When I reached her on the sun porch, I saw she was holding my rumpled notebook. "What's this?" she asked. Her smirk let me know she was in no mood for half-baked answers or sullen silence. "That's my notebook," I said more defensively than I intended. "What is this you're writing in here about me and folks at my church?" She flipped through the pages. "See, here's my name. Ella puts on her white usher board uniform and white shoes and heads to church every Sunday at the same time." I couldn't figure out why she was so angry. I hadn't misrepresented her. What was so bad about me noticing her? She went on, pointing out names of familiar places and people. "Why are you taking this down?" Even though I had pretended to be a spy, I figured my grandmother must know, how could she think otherwise, that these were only harmless notes, descriptive phrases that became sentences, seeds to stories I could write for my backyard audience of one. Surely, I thought, she couldn't believe I was a real spy. "I was just writing," I said. "They're just notes." "But for what? Why did you put my name on this paper?" I shrugged. That was enough to set her off. She reached for the fly swatter, the nearest weapon she could find, and popped me a few times on my bare legs. Tears came, but not from any pain inflicted by the fly swatter. I cried because once she put the fly swatter away, she peeled off page after page from my notebook and ripped each one into shreds. By destroying my first attempts at writing, though, my grandmother unwittingly lit a fire. Her act of intolerance was an important lesson about the power of words. There was something about what I had written that put her on the defensive, made her look at me differently, with a suspicion that at least promised engagement, if not acceptance. Words written were exhilarating but costly. People who were committed to them paid a price, I was learning. And that price, I would realize later, is where great stories come from. With these words set down so innocently, I was building a voice of my own, word by word, page by page. All learning is rest, for it is an admission that you don't know something and are willing to do whatever it takes to gain that knowledge, no matter the cost to ego, relationships, or expectations. Words that had lain so passively on pages before my relationship with the library now took on new meaning. Every word meant something, and together they could create storms, tirades, worry, suspicion. They could also liberate and weave fresh possibilities. All children have interior secret lives where their imaginations blossom and their perceptions of the worlds form. I was no different. As a reader, I was learning so much, but I somehow understood not all that I was learning should be shared. Okay, I'll stop.
All righty, one more time. Let's give a round of applause for we have copies of the book for sale, and we're also going to do a signing up here in front. So thank you all so much for coming.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you. Let's thank Brooks.
I'm gonna get to sign yours.
Oh, wow.
Wow.